Hello, and welcome to the Click and Obey podcast. Today we're doing video, so that's a big win for us. But also, Parmesh, we want to talk about some electricity. So, what would you like to know?
What's up, Derek? Yeah, so we are doing video. It's a first for us. Real first names as well because, well, it's kind of visible as it is. And I think people knew who we were anyways, people that listened. But yeah, I want to talk about something that may be near and dear to us, given some of the recent events that happened in Texas around uh, the power system going out, people losing heating and cooling, people losing electricity, people losing the ability to keep food good, people losing the ability to get access to water. So I was thinking maybe we could talk about one of those necessities, electricity, power in general, and talk about how we can become more self-sustaining around power, like not be so reliant on a power grid that is kind of at the behest of politics, which is not always a good thing.
Yeah, politics and just also in general some incompetent people. Like that's the bigger problem, right?
Yep.
If it was politics run by competent people, we'd have a much different scenario. But there's a lot of incompetence and a lot of things of just like not. I mean, there comes down to not winterizing, just other different things. But even just
Oh yeah.
the way stuff is laid out, people don't even know if emergency backups work or not. They haven't tested them. And so then they just spring them into action and hope that they work. And it's like that just wouldn't fly in any other industry. So, but
Right.
that's government for you. But we're going to not talk
Ugh.
about that. We're going to assume that the government sucks and is going to screw you in every facet. So now we're going to talk about like
Yep.
how do you how do you minimize your blast radius, so to speak, right? And so I think the first thing we have to look at is like, what are you actually trying to do? Because there's a multitude of ways to handle this. Because say that you are trying to hold out electricity for an hour, right? Like that's a totally different experience than if you're trying to hold it out for a year or multi-year, right? An hour could just mean it's like, hey, I need to contact somebody, right? I just need to have
Right.
enough energy to last an hour. Meaning, and when I say an hour, obviously I don't mean like stay in your house for an hour. What I mean is that
Right.
you need an hour's worth of energy to like make a phone call, like get on the internet, go find out stuff, right? It's a totally different scenario than like, oh man, I'm on life support, I've got an hour to live kind of deal. It's more like, how do you make sure you go to bed at night, it's 2 a.m., your phone stopped charging, the power goes out, and all of a sudden you wake up, you got no battery on your phone, you don't know what the hell's going on, you can't call anybody, your power's out. What do you do, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's a real scenario. Like that's the kind of thing that happened to people. They had this, Monday morning, 2 a.m., everything drops out. If your phone hadn't been charged by then, like good luck to you, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then on the converse side, storing up for years, and we'll get into that. But I think we start with the kind of I'll call it the local approach first, right? Which is like, how do you just make sure that you can contact people and figure out what the hell is going on? Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think that's perfect because these are completely different scenarios. We could work through some of the other scenarios too, but this is probably the one, like I said, is probably nearest and dearest to us. Is actually what people experienced here in real life. It's like you wake up, nothing is working. You don't have a network to go to, and you have to solve that problem right away. So how can we approach this in a world where we're more independent of a national power grid or a state power grid or whatever?
Yeah, and I think for this first one, right, it's like battery backups and like a small solar generator are your best friends, right?
Right.
Like there's
Yep.
battery backups they sell. Half the time they're giving away as swag, quite honestly, at just a lot of these different conferences. But the concept is you've got this kind of like almost pin size little USB looking thing where you plug it into a computer or outlet or whatever you want to do with USB. It's got a little micro USB on the other side. You charge it up. It's got maybe 2 to 3 hours worth of charge on it. And then you have on the other side of it an actual USB port where you can plug in your phone or any device really, right? Like it's just a battery. Like you could do whatever you want that has a USB connector. So that's a way that you can make sure that your phone always is going to have a charge. And these things are cheap. They're, $30, $50, depending on how big a size you want to get it. That's a good way to go. There's also these kind of like solar converters because the sun will always rise at some point, right? Doesn't mean it's going to be tomorrow, but whether it's a week from now, a day from now, an hour from now, the sun will come out and these little solar generators can just produce power just at any point, right? So you don't have to worry, oh man, did my battery backup, did the battery in my battery backup die? It's like, oh no, this
Oh
solar
yeah.
generator is still going to work. right? Or,
Right.
or did you forget to charge your battery back up? Like that, also a thing. So there's something like that. Those are a little more costly. They're in like the 80 to 100 range, depending on just how big and bulky you want to get. But those are the first two things, right? If you just want something like, hey, I guarantee I can have a phone to call people, right? Like those are your first two things to look at. And those are the things that probably most people want because they're going to trust the government to a much greater extent than you or I will.
Yeah, and I want to throw another one in there. It depends on what state you live in and what sort of style of living you have, but another one that could be used for this hour-long scenario is the car, right?
Good call.
Like the car, assuming it has gas, and assuming you have that 12 volt plug-in ability, you can probably plug in a few USB devices. I think you can probably even charge like a low-level laptop, and you could plug in, if you have an inverter, you could actually plug in some emergency stuff. I don't know if it's necessarily good for a 1 hour scenario, but we can probably get to that later. But a car is kind of a good, emergency valve. It's almost like a big battery powered on stored gas. Like,
Right. And it's one thing that you're always going to keep charged, right? I mean, in theory, assuming
right,
your
yeah.
alternator's not broken and your battery's not just like 8 years old and bad, it's like you kind of inherently have this natural battery because in a battery backup or even a solar generator, it's like, well, do you keep track of them? Do you make sure all the wires are working? Do you make sure the battery has it? Do you make sure that battery has not died over time? Right? It's like your car inherently gets used, even if it's not daily, right? It might be at least weekly you're using it. So you're inherently going to keep that battery up. So yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
one.
and also like if you do need to fill it back up, if you're near a gas station and you have cash, um, if the electricity is down, I don't know how much about gas stations are run on electricity. I guess probably too much to assume that the pump would work. But
Yeah. The thing is, I think the well would work in the sense that, like, yeah, you could pump the gas,
mm,
but there's going to be electronics that register like the cost. So it's
that's
like
right.
you're
Yeah.
probably not going to have the ability to do that. Like somebody would, right? If they want to bypass the actual like mechanism that's controlling the pump, yeah, that pump is probably mechanical in some form. It can be done without electricity, or at least with very minor modifications. But because it's run through this kind of system that's electronic payments, I don't know what's going to inhibit it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I have no idea if like a gas station could run off of a backup generator or something like that. So that's probably not a scenario worth exploring. But yeah, I just wanted to add on like the car as a temporary battery as well. And definitely those solar panels, like I second those. Definitely, those are extremely useful. I think I have one from like the company For Patriots or something like that. Someone gave it to me
Mm,
as a gift. You just clip it on onto your back and just go out in the sun, and
exactly.
it's pretty good. You put your phone in the low battery mode or whatever, so it uses up a little bit less juice, and it keeps it. You can definitely get a few percentage out of it. You can make calls. Um, those USB kind of charge them up and let them sit batteries that have a couple USB ports on them. Those are really good too. Um, yeah, I think that's probably where I would go in a pinch.
Yeah, those are your two like everybody should probably have these on hands kind of things, right? It's like, hey, have enough that in case your phone, like the power went out right after you went to sleep, just after you charge it, you like started charging your phone. Now you got to contact somebody. You got to go look up what's happening. You got to figure out like, is power coming back on? Is it going to be off for a while? Like these are things that are just aren't that costly, right? I mean, cost is relative. Some people have more money than others, obviously. But if we're talking in the less than 100 range, most people can probably afford them or find ways to get them. So I think like if we're covering that, probably the next step up, right, is like how do you survive for, let's call it 2 days, right? Like you could say a day, 2 days, three, a week, whatever you want to say. But that's where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, you need some way of generating your own power, right? Like that's the next scenario, I think.
Right, yeah, because if you're saying a day, or we could even say 2 days, like that's probably good enough, like to have a day and a night in that time interval. And uh, I think that's a really good scenario because at nighttime, depending on where you are, it might get super cold. What are you going to do then, right? Do you have family members? Do you have to eat? Um, all those questions kind of come into play. It's a completely different scenario from just like 1 or 2 hours without electricity. So yeah, we can approach it from a number of areas. First, I would say like, do you have family? And if you have family, some members take precedence over others in terms of your worries for electricity. So I would say if you have a baby and that baby isn't breastfeeding, for example, maybe that baby is bottle feeding, you need a way to warm the bottle. And you also have to worry about if you have frozen milk, keeping that milk frozen. And if you have powdered, um, formula, this is not a problem for you. But you still need some electricity there. You need to be able to make a bottle for the baby if the baby's not breastfed. So those are the type of scenarios that come into play as soon as you start talking about 1 or 2 days or even a week. And that's the stuff that comes to mind. And so I feel like maybe you have a suggestion for what the power source might be there.
So there's a few different ways to go about it, right? And I think the first thing that people need to do is figure out like how likely are they to actually use this and not just flee, right? Like fleeing is always an option, right? Because especially if you have people in other states that you can go to and it's like, you know what, I'm just going to take the 12-hour drive because I think my power is going to be out for several days, right? Like that's a real thing. Or maybe it's even, you don't have to go 12 hours, you got to go 30 minutes, right? It's like if you're in Texas, a lot of places are within, I mean, everywhere there's a lot of places within 30 minutes, right? But it's just like you can be in Texas and a whole lot of places are 30 minutes away from you inside of Texas, right? It's very easy to get to is what I'm saying. And so it's like, you got to ask yourself that question. Are you just going to flee or not, assuming it's more than a day? And it's totally valid. I'm not suggesting that's not a valid option, right? It's just a matter of like, are you going to, and if you flee somewhere, how likely is it they're impacted by the same issues you have? And if they are impacted, how is it that they have the backup that they can now handle this, right? After that, you got to figure out necessities. Because like you said, right, it's like, okay, some people need energy more than others. You know, some things need more energy than others, and some things are more important, right? It's like if your electricity is cut out, you got to figure out, okay, how am I accessing food, sanitized water, because water does not run on electricity, but sanitation might be a problem too, depending on the situation, right? So how do I have sanitized water? My heating, my cooling, right? If you're lucky, the power goes out in the middle of March in Texas and it never changes between 70 and 80 degrees. And you're just like,
right, yeah,
whatever, man, I'll just, I'll stick it out. And you just buy yourself a little generator, right? Like a $400 kind of like oil-based generator that you just kind of throw some gas in and let it run. And that thing will basically run your, not your AC, it'll run your refrigerator, maybe an oven if you kind of swap it off, and then maybe a couple of other things, right? It's pretty light. It's not meant for the wholesale. But if you've got say a microwave and a fridge, and then your heating and cooling don't matter because it's March in the middle of Texas, you're great. Now, if it's fucking summer in Texas or the coldest winter ever in Texas, good luck to you, right? This is not, that's not a real solution for you as far as the generator goes. A generator is for a very specific purpose, and it's likely not in the worst case scenario the generator is going to matter to you that much. It's really in the like, hey, it's bad but not too bad situation.
Yeah, 100%. I think also worth mentioning, because it depends. So with the gas generator, that depends on you having gas available.
True.
Which we talked about. You might not be able to get it on demand. Another possible generator and we've seen these kind of recently, is the solar generators, which are more expensive. I believe they're probably in the $800 range.
Yeah,
it's quite a money sink.
800 to 1,000. If you want a little bit bigger generator, it's around 2,000 or so. But yeah, it's somewhere in the 1,000 to 2,000 range.
And that one is a better, if you want something that's on demand that doesn't have a dependency on something that might have a dependency on electricity, that might be another possible option for you.
Yeah, I think both of those are good ones, right? I mean, the solar, like you said, that's the big catch-all, and that's the big one. Like, if you think a generator is going to help you, because it all depends on exactly when you get hit. Like, if you're in Texas, that generator, when the ice storm hits, like that generator is going to do shit. It got to like 30 degrees in most houses, and so you can run a space heater on a generator, right? Like that is a thing you can do. But you're also going to have to lock that room up and make sure that you like can consolidate that heat and maintain it. Because if it just goes away instantly, right, it's not going to do anything for you. So, yeah, generator's that one step where it's like, it's kind of the mid-grade, right? It's like the low grade is that, hey, battery backup, have a phone, be able to skedaddle.
Right, yeah.
And then you've got the, like, long-term options, which we'll talk about next, which can actually like power you for a while. And the generator's like very specific purposes where it's like, hey, if you don't think it's going to be the worst summer or winter ever, you're probably fine. But otherwise, I almost like look at it as a pass. I don't know what your thoughts on generators are.
Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan. I feel similar to you. There's some stuff where it's like if you're in, I mean, if you're in a fortunate situation where the weather doesn't change, you're probably fine. But if you are in a situation where the weather can change drastically, and we've seen that in Texas, for example, where it can get really hot and then get pretty cold within one day, um, I mean, honestly, you're left like probably sleeping in your car at that point. Using your car for the AC and the small contained unit that it is. Um, that's probably where you're left. Like the generator is not really going to help you throughout the entire night.
Yeah, agreed. And not to mention too the space. I mean, that's a question for some people, right? It's like
Yep.
I, my garage could maybe fit that if I just move a lot of other stuff out of the way. But it's
There's
like I
that
just don't
too.
have a ton of space. I mean, yeah, I'm luckier than most, right? I've got a garage that actually has some space that can do stuff in it, but like that's not everybody either. So it's like it's kind of a problem. I mean, if you're in an apartment, like good luck, right? Where the fuck are you storing this generator at? It's not a thing. Skedaddle is probably your best option, assuming that you've got a car that can drive on the ice. Which
Oh
like
yeah, there is that. Yeah, there
yeah.
is that. Like fleeing is not always an option either. Like if you live on top of a hill, and
Oh,
yeah, the roads are iced. It's like, well, that downhill trek, which you might not be able to make back uphill, could be pretty dangerous.
man. So I feel like we're both kind of we lean towards out on the generator, right? Like anybody who wants to
Yeah,
get one, it's a good hedge, like because it can do stuff, and if you have the space for it, like absolutely, like if you've got the space and the money for it, 100% go that route. The next one is the long term, right? It's like, okay, how can I last a
yeah.
week, 2 weeks, hell, even like a year if shit really went down, right? Because I don't know if you heard in Texas, but they said it's like, oh, we were only a couple different things away from having like a month's outage because it would have like fried everything. And it's like,
Unbelievable.
Jesus, like what? Uh,
Yep.
yeah. So I mean, if you're looking at something like that, right? How do you generate that much power? Honestly, the only thing I can even think of is solar, right? Is there anything besides solar that can really? I mean, obviously things can generate that much power, but I mean at like a household level, is there anything besides solar that even comes close?
I mean, it's going to sound crazy, but it does work if you meet all the conditions. But wind, like if you have enough land to have a windmill
That's fair.
of some sort, you can actually get quite a bit of power from that. And one of the examples I'll use is I don't know if you ever heard of Belize, the country Belize.
Yes.
So they have a lot of like little islands off the coast of Belize. They call them Keys, Caye, I think is how you spell it.
The Keys of
And all of
Belize.
those, yeah, the
Very
Keys of
nice.
Belize, and all those islands. Some of them are very small. They're like a mile stretch. They're pretty skinny. Um, but they have to have their own power source because they're just far enough apart to where you can't really
Right. You can't do a
do
grid
anything
really
too
there, right?
concentrated.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's a little difficult to do a grid. Um, and almost all of them, from what I saw, had windmills because they have a ton of wind. They also had solar, but I'm just saying that
Right. Yeah. It's
wind was one of
another
the
piece
sources.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and they had like skinny windmills, and they worked pretty well. And they had other stuff too. They had like backup generators and whatnot. But like you could go there. There was Wi-Fi that was pretty slow, but they had Wi-Fi.
Something.
You had the ability to power a couple devices. Like it was functional. It was functional.
Yeah. I
And
think
so
yeah, like you said,
yeah, if
assuming
you
you have enough land, that's the interesting one, right? Is like the windmill portion of it. Um, I don't. Granted, I don't know that much about the maintenance on the solar as well, so I don't know what the maintenance cost of wind is. Solar, I have a little bit more knowledge of, not in the sense that I know how to maintain a solar panel, just that I've known people who have solar panels and they don't do a whole lot of maintenance on them, right? So if the wind is
right,
in
the
that
moving
same,
parts.
yeah, if the wind is in that same camp, then great. I just don't know if it is.
I would say no. So the thing with wind is, it's less efficient in terms of land usage per output.
Hmm.
And also there are more moving parts. So with the solar, I don't know too much about solar like in technical detail, but I do know it has less moving parts. And in general, less moving parts means less maintenance, higher durability. With a windmill, obviously there's moving parts, and with Texas, like we had a bunch of things go wrong in Texas. We had like natural gas pipelines freezing. Some of the windmills froze, right? So the moving parts are something to keep track of. So wind is probably not the best option here. I think you're right. Solar is kind of the best option per square foot in terms of maintenance. In terms of availability, like if you had to choose, I know it sounds silly choosing between the sun and the wind, but if you had to choose between the two, I think you always choose the sun.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I just thought of too. It's like I heard of somebody saying that there's like a propane generator that you can also use, because you basically just like buy a propane tank or multiple propane tanks, and you just kind of like use that to convert that energy into electricity, right? Which makes sense because like propane is used to heat houses all the time, depending on where you're at, right? Some people use that, some people use natural gas. It just depends, but it's a totally valid option. I heard they're like 8,000 or so, and that's where you get into price. The prices of these systems are kind of that's the big
Yeah.
problem. Like you have to really be preparing for it. Because much as people like to tout how solar is going to pay for itself over time, very rarely fucking happens. Like if you get lucky and need no maintenance over like 15 years, sure. But as soon as you need maintenance, like the cost of maintenance is heavy as hell. So
Yeah, which you're going right into a point that I wanted to bring up, which is that if you're talking about some of these more long-term approaches, at this point, it's not even about emergency preparation anymore. It's about switching your power input structure, like switching how you actually get power on a daily basis because of that cost. It's like this is an investment that you can't just afford to have sitting around for a rainy day. At this point, it's like, oh, I actually have to rely on this given the cost that I'm putting in. I actually have to use this, unless you're phenomenally rich. But
yeah, one day,
yeah,
one day.
one day. So it's like, yeah, if you're going down this route of solar or wind, it's almost like it's not just for emergency. It's probably going to be a source of electricity in your daily life that is actually taking away or completely replacing your grid usage, right?
Right. And I think that's where solar has that, it has the best chance of that, right? Because, like, yeah, it's probably not going to pay for itself necessarily, but it does have a chance of removing your electricity bill and basically meaning that you're not on the grid, right? And you may even generate power into the grid, which helps to subsidize some of the cost of your solar installation. And that too, the nice thing is the same as the car. It's constant use, right? You don't have to
Yeah,
worry. Oh man,
constant
did I
use.
hook it up? Is it going to work this time? Have I been testing it on a yearly basis to make sure? It's like, no, you do it every day, right? And especially if you
Yeah,
go with like, say like a Tesla implementation where they've got the battery wall where you have 2.5 days of battery, right? It's like, yeah, the sun might not be out right now, right? So you might have zero energy produced as of right now. But if you have 2.5 days, the chances there's no sun for like 3 days straight, depending on where you're at, right? It's like if you're in Texas, pretty much none. It's gonna happen, even if it's cold as hell. You're gonna have sunlight.
yeah, and I think that's what gives solar probably the most advantage. So hold
We
on
have
one second.
we have dogs joining in.
Yeah, yeah, we do.
What's
Hold on
their
one second.
take?
So one of the things about wind is there's no kind of commercial infrastructure to do what you're saying right now, right? Like there's no storage mechanism that sits on the wall of your garage or something like that. So it's which probably technically possible, but it's not available. You'd have to probably make it yourself or like order some highly custom thing from somebody
Right. Yeah, and
and
that's
then make
where that's really where solar kind of wins in this too, right? It's not even that's like okay, the sun is better than the wind or anything else. Like it's just that it's more prevalent, right? Like there are people who've done this, and we've seen the implementations. There are multiple vendors for it. There's solutions that have battery backups, no battery backups. There's stuff where it's like, hey, generate, off of 4 panels, 8 panels, 12 panels. It's got all these different implementations. So that makes it a lot easier to manage, right? Now you're also talking about fucking what $12,000 or more for the installation, depending on size, right? It's all dependent also where you live, construction, permits, blah 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 blah. But like you're talking probably 10 grand at minimum. Another interesting option with the solar panels is a solar roof. They actually make like solar tiles that you can just make your
Oh
entire
yeah.
roof out of, which I find that to be really interesting. I like the look a lot better than having like a roof and then solar panels on top of it. But that's again, if I had 20 grand to just like throw at shit right now, maybe I'd feel like doing that. It turns out I do not. Um,
Yeah. I think most people do not.
Once again, one day.
Yeah, I think the average 30-year-old or something is worth $7,000 right now. That might be difficult. I think
That's
that was the latest stat. Uh,
Yeah. I've got a touch more than that, but it's not.
yeah,
I'm not.
sa-
I'm
same here.
Yeah,
But
but 30-year-olds struggling right now. 20-year-olds really struggling, but 30-year-olds maybe not as good as in past generations.
yeah, I don't think so. But yeah, so I think in general our consensus, which I expected, kind of seems that, given the momentum in the commercial space with solar, so the availability of all the things you would need to make solar infrastructure work locally pretty decently. Um, in terms of the long-term storage, is probably the best bet. Now, if you're out maybe a little further from the city, um, I think at that point you start looking at wind, actually, because you will probably have more land.
Hmm.
Um, if you're out from the city, I'm willing to bet you're probably not necessarily using as much power a lot of the time, depending on how far out you are. People who live outside the city, like way far out, um, I'm thinking about like farms and kind of farmhouses and ranches and things like that. They might not use as much electricity out there. I don't know if that's true in general, but
It really
uh,
depends, right? Because like coming from like a bit of a farm background, right? We didn't have like a full on ranch, but I did my share of hauling hay and whatnot. It's like we don't use as much energy in the household level, most likely.
hmm,
But if you've got heaters for horses or cows or goats or anything, because you've got troughs that are running, like you don't want them to freeze with all the water. So it's like you need to have some kind of electric current going into it to like heat it up some, not to like
right,
any kind of reasonable. It's just to keep it from not freezing, right? You're talking about 34 degrees, but it's like, and then that, so you've got like kind of like lights going on the horses, so that if they're in the stalls and everything, and if it's 0 degrees outside, like you can keep them somewhat warm. And they're tougher than humans, obviously, right? But like you're still trying to make it to where like they're not going from like, oh, I've got this nice setup. Oh shit, I froze my ass off because I'm not prepared for this. I'm not a wild, horse, cow, donkey, goat, whatever you want to call it, right? So
yeah,
so there can be for sure, but sometimes it is like the generation does add up over the course of like the entire farm as opposed to at the household level.
I see. That's a real fair point. Yeah, but I guess more to the point, like I think windmills will work better the further away you are from the city, just because of the land restriction. Like, and
Yeah.
maybe you need two. I don't know. Maybe you need a bigger windmill. And it's not something you can prop up in a neighborhood. You know.
Now without some like not having to have HOAs, that'd be very interesting as a non HOA person myself. It's like, oh, could I just plop a windmill in the backyard, just call it a day? I think I might.
Yeah.
Like, there's some limits even to the HOA level. I'm pretty sure. I don't know what
Yeah,
the
I think
city
so.
ordinance is.
I don't think you could paste a windmill on top of your house either, like you
Yeah,
could with solar panels. So,
yeah. I haven't seen it, so it's like I can't say that's for sure, but I haven't seen it, so I feel like it's probably true that that's not a thing you can do.
yeah.
So
So yeah,
so
I think.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, so one thing I did want to touch back on, right? So I think we've got kind of the three cases, right? We'll call it the long term or like short term, medium term, long term, as far as like how you want to manage stuff, right? From like, hey, I just need an hour of juice to go get my phone started so I can call somebody and get a plan out here. Medium of like, hey, I'm going to last a couple days. I've just got to run the refrigerator, make sure everything doesn't spoil, go from there. And the long term, which is like, hey, I could last a year. Now, probably if I have to last a year, civilization has died off, but presumably, right, like you could make it happen in theory. Um, and the next part after that, right, is like, what are the necessities? Because I think that's the big thing too
Oh
of
yeah.
like, if you are trying to determine what level you need and how you're going to handle things, like what's the necessities you have? Because if you're like a single 24-year-old dude who's like he's mostly going out to eat, you just don't have a whole lot in the fridge anyway, and like you could go run to like wherever you needed to, right? Like you just go
Yeah.
walk out and go. you probably don't need a whole lot, right? Just have your hour and go. Now, if you've got a family of 6 and you've got kids to feed and they're all young, so traveling is going to be a real hell of a thing, and you're worried about ice storms more than, like a summer heat wave or something like that, it's like traveling might become impossible. So how are you going to be able to bunker in, right? So like thinking of these necessities and like what you need to handle for each of these situations is way different.
Yeah, I think 100%. Like if you're the 24-year-old, you can get by with a lot of shortcuts. You could just eat Cliff Bars for like 10 days at least at a time or something like that, or canned food. You can just kind of get by on that. When you have a family, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into it. If you have older members, they might have special needs, and you have to find a way to get with those. You've got to worry about medicine and all that. So there's like externalities that come into play there. With babies, I mean, like I said before, the bottle warmer, that's a big one for a lot of people who feed their babies through bottles. You either need a bottle warmer or a microwave or some way of boiling water and then sticking the bottle in the boiled water. So you have to tune for those, and also like babies can't handle, and old people also cannot handle huge range in temperature, like you mentioned. So you have to have stuff. I mean, in terms of necessities, you got to have stuff to help control the weather a little bit. So in terms of the cold, which I think is probably worse than the heat overall. Babies tend to like heat. I think older people tend to like heat, so you can get away with a little bit there. But in terms of cold, you got to have blankets, like actual blankets. Make sure they're not wet or easily wet. Like you have to have a lot of blankets actually. If you're talking about like 20, 30 degrees or something like that, like you have to have mountains of blankets. Like 1 or 2 blankets won't do it for you. You got to have like jackets, insulated jackets if you can get that, like thermal underwear if you can get that. There's a lot of like on the clothing side I'm thinking about really, but there's a lot of different things that you should have if you have a family and you're in a situation where power's gone for a long time and you might not be able, you might have to bunker down. You have to have stuff available like that you could put on your body that can help you solve the problems that you have.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's kind of now's the time to point into, right? It's like we're talking purely on the electricity side, right? We're not really touching on food and water. Those will be separate podcasts on kind of like what we talk about as far as this goes. But it's like you also have to factor in what do you think is going to go out and what do you have available to you if the electricity goes out, right? Because like you mentioned, the 24-year-old guy, if you got Cliff Bars and water and everything like that, and the temperature's not that bad, maybe it gets down to 50 at night, but it goes up to 75 during the day and stuff like that. You're just like, nah, fuck it. I'm gonna enclose this room, add some towels under the doors to make sure the heat stays in here, right? And I'm good to go. I don't care. Also, I've got a gas stove, so it's like, yeah, you just cook stuff on the gas stove, right? It's like the stuff in the fridge maybe spoils, but you're like, whatever. I don't really care. I can live on these Cliff Bars and whatever else I might have. It's like, yeah, then your electricity needs are way down. If you've got the whole family and you've got an electric stove and an oven and things like that, right? So your cooking is all tied around electricity. Well, you better have a fucking way of figuring that out, right? Like that's a totally different thing than if you can cook stuff on the stove and go. Same way, if you've got some kind of like system that runs your water through it to sanitize it, right? You've got a reverse osmosis or something else like that. I actually don't know if those need electricity. I think some of them do. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm off base on this. But say you have something that needs like power in order to run your water through it to sanitize it, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's like, well, that's a problem, right? You need to have more electricity for that. If you've got it, if all your food is microwavable, right? It's all frozen or stored in the refrigerator or whatever. You also need a lot of electricity. So, I mean, it's like those things. Yeah, those things add up, right? It's not just about how do you maintain the stuff you're stored. It's how do you eat? How do you drink? How do you stay warm? And like those things, they depend, basically depending on how your lifestyle is and also where you live. Because Texas, we're much more likely to overheat than we are to overcool, bar these random winter storms. But if you're in the Northeast, the whole thing is you're going to freeze much faster than you're going to overheat, right? So you got to prepare for totally different situations.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the unique thing about the electricity thing is it's kind of tied into some of the other necessities, like you said, food and water, and we can frankly do completely separate podcasts on those. But like that's another thing to consider if you're without electricity for a long time. It's like you've got to have another way to produce produce food, or like especially if you have families, like you can't all be eating Cliff Bars, right? Um, like, do you have a grill? Do you have other stuff that helps you um, to be able to lean away from electricity? Um, that's the type of stuff you have to worry about. And also food going bad. So like let's say you have a lot of frozen food and all that. You have to have a way to keep that food, or at least have food available that is friendlier to not having electric refrigeration or a freezer available at all times.
Right.
So there's some prep there that you can do. Um, and you could actually include it in your daily life, right? Like if you have a grill, you can use that a little bit and like lessen your reliance on these electric utilities that we all kind of tend to rely on. Um, in terms of food, you don't always have to have frozen food, or you don't always have to have spoilable food. Like you can incorporate canned foods in your daily life too. They're perfectly
Right.
fine.
And then too, right? It's a question of like, so you have say you have spoilable foods, right? You've got steaks in the freezer or just anything, frozen pizzas, you name it. It's like if you're in the Northeast and your electricity going out, most likely means that it's frozen over. I mean, you throw that shit outside. It's like if it's 20 degrees outside, guess what? Built-in fridge, like done. You don't have to worry about this, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if you're in Texas, if the heat goes out or if the electricity goes out, it's usually during the summer, or even if it's not during the summer, it's not going to be freezing outside, right? So it's like you don't have the built-in refrigeration. You got to figure that out. So it's like the way that you're going to be impacted by the power outage is probably totally different. And like at a certain point, you can either have enough money that you can be prepared for anything, and if you're like the rest of us that don't have that kind of money, you have to guess what is the most likely scenario and prepare for that. Because yeah, sure, you could prepare for 100-degree days in Boston. When the fuck is that happening? Right? Like, is that a real scenario you're worried about? That one day every, and maybe if that happens, it really is going to screw you over because the electric grid's going to go down because everybody's AC's running, if you even have AC there. But it's like the most likely scenario is right. You've got a winter storm and you've got to suffer that out for a few days. So it's like, yeah, look into the things you can utilize, which is that, hey, I've got a built-in fridge and freezer, so I don't have to worry about a generator for that. But I might have a stove that is purely electricity, right? So it's like I do need to have a generator or some power source for that. So I mean, it's just totally matters depending on your situation.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, I don't know that I had a whole lot more on the electricity side, right? Most of it's just, hey, we gave you kind of the three scenarios, and the big thing for you is just go prepare and figure out what is your most likely scenario of when you could get hit and what are your biggest problems, right? Is like, is it going to be creating food or not creating food, but like, being able to eat food because you don't have that stuff on hand? Is it going to be able to stay warm? Is it be able to like process your water because like, hey, your sanitation is a real fucking problem and you already have to have something that runs through it? It's like, those are the real questions you need to ask is like, what are your biggest gaps and then solve for those, or come up with a flee plan of like how the hell you can get out of Dodge. It's like
Right, yeah.
your plan might be, you know what, I'm just gonna go buy a 4-wheel drive truck and I'm gonna be able to fucking leave if shit happens. It's like, all right,
Yeah.
that's a solution.
That's a solid thing. I want to circle back on that because it's like, yes, there's the prep option, and there's different ways you can prep. We just talked about the different levels of prep that you can do based on your situation, based on your income. But there's also other options. There's the flee option. So prepping to flee, basically. You have that if you have that available. That's a good option too. Another one is the one that I think we touched on a few times, which is like, can some element of this thing be a part of your daily life?
Yes.
Right? Like if you're further out from society and you operate a windmill as a primary source of electricity for you, and maybe you're still plugged into the grid, but it's like you have two sources of electricity, let's say, you're living with that windmill, and so you don't have to prep. And also it allows you to kind of sink more resources into it, whatever resources you do have, because it's actually part of it's not this side thing that you do with the extra money that you have per month. It's like, oh, this is part of my house payment, basically, or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I think that's a really
and with
good
the solar,
point. Because like it's
yeah,
something we would touch on a lot more on like food and water and stuff like that. But it's like living with the system, right? Because like it's great to have backups, but if you don't use them except for once every 5 years and they've broken because you didn't maintain them, well, good luck to you. Like that's the same as not having anything. So if you can have your
yeah,
backup built into your daily life, that makes it much better than a backup, right? Like that just makes it a part
right,
of it.
yeah. It makes it a part of it. It's something you're thinking about constantly, and there's something to be said about, in general, just having that mental thing in your head of like, I'm a little bit less reliant than I was on these large central utilities. Um, but yeah, if you can live with it a little bit more, it's just small things like a grill, right? Like a non-electric grill, like using that every once in a while. Like, hey, I'm going to go grill corn on the cob or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm gonna
these are all like living with it is another option. And you don't have to choose between these three options, right? You don't have to choose between prepping. You don't have to choose between living with it a little bit or fleeing. You can mix these three, I think is our main point. Generally, people, when they think of like, oh, disaster prep, they're thinking like, oh, it's like solidly always preparing, like building a bunker with whatever money that you have. But it's like, no, you can achieve this type of lessening of your reliance on these things while also being a little bit more prepared for crazy emergencies, even like long-term ones, by doing these other two options, like knowing how to flee, knowing how to incorporate some of it in your living. One thing I did want to touch on before we go is working. So let's say things are bad
Yeah.
enough um, to where you have to think about a month, 2 months, something like that. Um, so you made a good point earlier, which I wanted to circle back on, which is that society might be totally fucked at that point if it's that bad. So you might not have to worry about work. And then there's a whole money thing that goes along with that, but that might not be something you have to worry about immediately. So that might not be a realistic thing. If it's that bad for for a larger number of people to where you can't even really flee or anything like that, that might be an indication that society is doing pretty bad. Um,
Hmm.
so work might not be a thing for you at that point. But let's say it's a little bit, it's in that range, a few months, whatever, or even just a few weeks. But like most of the U.S. is still functioning, and you need to work, you need income. So this is where you run into limitations because you have externalities. Um, and really, there's not that many great answers. Um, as you can tell from my dogs, it's not that many great answers. But with the internet, either you have cable, which is something you're tied into the system, or you have maybe Starlink, satellite internet, 5G, 4G. You're still tied into a physical system. Maybe not as much as the other systems like electricity or water or anything like that, but you're still tied in. So, but work itself is an externality.
Hmm.
So that's where this thing kind of hits a limit, I think, is when you have to start thinking about like, well, I had this job that was bringing in my income, and I was using that income to do all these things for my family. Now I don't have that income, or I still need to keep doing my job somehow. I think that's where you start to run into some really challenging, um, limiting problems.
Yeah, agreed, right? Because then it's a question of like, are you surviving or are you living with the problem? Right? Because like if it's just a day or
Oh,
two,
yeah,
you're probably just, hey, just survive it, right? It's like, hey, just deal with
survive.
it, and then afterwards, the, the government will take care of it. No, no, they won't. Just trust that
Okay.
that's never actually going to happen. The government will take care of nothing. They'll cause problems and then blame you for them. But if you want to live through a situation where it's like, hey, this is a big problem that's occurred, right? And I've got a week or 2 weeks or whatever. That's the real question: is are you just going to survive this week and just be like, hey, bare minimum, I've got food, I've got water, I'm not going to have to shower, blah, 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 the whole thing? Or am I going to be able to live through it where it's like, yeah, this is kind of annoying, but I'm at like 80% capacity as opposed to 25%?
Right, yeah. That's a great point too. It's like, are you living with it? That's another question that you have to think about. And if you are, then it's like, well, this is less about prep and it's more about incorporating it into your lifestyle at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Or moving to Costa Rica.
Always an option.
Yeah, always an option. But yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add other than that. I think the main takeaway is what we just pointed out, which is like there's more than one way to do this, and you can attack on different vectors. You don't have to be single-minded building a bunker. Um,
Yeah,
there's
like
actually
I think we've learned
quite options.
prepping does not mean like bunkering in, and also preppers are not these crazy conspiracy people because like shit happens,
No, they're
right?
not.
Winter storms happen, and so it's really just backup plans, right? That's what it is. And it's like, what's your backup plan, and then what's your backup plan for your backup plan, and what's the backup plan for that
Yeah.
backup plan, right? And it's like you don't
Yeah.
need to have 38 layers of backup plans, but assume that your first one is going to fail because you don't know what the fuck you're doing even coming up with this backup
Yeah.
plan. So then make the backup plan for that and just kind of like however many layers of backup plans you have, that's your layers of security, right? And that's how you can
Yeah.
be pretty sure that in a situation you're going to at least have some idea of what to do because you've already got multiple plans.
Yeah. There's no harm in having a plan C.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fact.
And by the way, it doesn't have to be an emergency, right? Like it can be it can be just jackassery. Like, didn't Oregon lose their power around the time that Texas did
Fucking
for not
everybody
that great
did.
of a reason?
And I still
Yeah.
keep hearing about the Texas somehow private energy grid. Like that's a thing. Like we don't follow public regulations. They're just silly people say silly things. But yeah, Oregon, Mississippi, like all over the country, kind of lost it on
Yeah.
each grid. It just depended on what the
Lost it.
setup was and which incompetent bureaucrat was running stuff.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a natural emergency. It can, or even a political emergency. It could just be life. It could just be incompetence from a
Can
thing run by
also be
bureaucrats.
the Russians, because I hear that that's who's to blame for everything. So I
Oh yeah,
assume,
that's right. Russia.
yeah. But you shouldn't trust me. I might be a Russian agent.
It might
Probably,
be.
maybe. I don't know.
I think I see you watching Russia Today over there in the corner.
Wait, but is that? Damn, I might be a Russian agent. You're right. I was
Yeah.
trying to think of some way I could get out of that, and it's like, no, I think you're probably right.
I think I caught you. Yeah.
Damn.
That's
All
all
right. Well,
evidence we need.
now that we've sufficiently blamed Russia for this, and I think we should end every show blaming Russia for something. Uh,
That's good. Great idea.
yeah, that's 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 probably it on our side.
Yeah, I think so. All right. Well, this was a good one. Let's attack the other topics as well. I think we'll do that in follow-up videos.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have what I would call the core five, which is water, food, electricity, heating and cooling, and sanitation. And electricity kind of spreads across all of them. That's why we started with that. But they
Yeah.
all also have their own individual things that you can do to manage.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think if you're watching this, you know where to get us. We are experimenting with video, so you're going to see us on some video platforms, YouTube, Odyssey, are probably the big two right now.
Yeah, we're open to others, but those are the two easy ones to manage that have
Yeah.
like good populations that we can work with.
Yeah. So we're changing up our strategy of what we're going to do with this podcast. We're beginning to experiment a little bit, and I think it'll be pretty fun. But yeah, um, like us, subscribe to us on those various platforms. Tell your friends about us, and I think you'll be hearing more from us soon.
All right. Peace.
Peace.